So Creon Levit is the Director of Research and Development at Planet. They're a firm that does satellite imagery. I was like on their website a couple of days ago and like downloading these super high definition photos of satellite imagery, which is really cool. And previously he was at the NASA Ames Research Center and has worked in aerospace for most of his career. So Creon, it's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Sebastian. I'm thrilled. Right, the title of my talk right now is called Potential Upsides of COVID-19. And my apologies if anyone has already seen me give an earlier version of this talk, but I've updated it now. I gave it like a long time ago. And some things have changed. And so, yeah, I decided kind of early on, why not, look at potential upsides. Everyone is wringing their hands and, afraid they're going to die with the virus. And so I thought, okay, there's enough of that. There's that famous "never let a good crisis go to waste" quote, who I can't remember who it's attributed to, but I was thinking, oh, what are some ways that what are some things that might actually just naturally and with high probability occur that are good because of the virus, and what are some things that are maybe possible, and then also what are some things that are kind of impossible, but unless we explicitly go for it and try to make it happen, that the things that we could leverage in the crisis and make positive changes. So yeah, I'm going to present just like a sort of spectrum of ideas on this, and then hopefully we have time at the end where people can ask questions, or more importantly, give me new ideas I can steal, so that in the next version of this talk, I've got even more potential upsides that I can discuss. Okay, so first couple things before we get into the ideas. The first thing is that, as I said, only a few of these are original. Most of them are stolen, and I try to give credit where credit is due where I've stolen them. But if I miss something, do let me know if you know the source. The other thing is that every one of these quote unquote, potential upsides or good ideas or whatever having to do with COVID, probably almost all of them have a shadow side. Like, you could run it the other way. There could be unforeseen consequences. Things might not work out in the sort of naively optimistic way I'm presenting, or maybe they're just a bad idea masquerading as a good idea. So I recognize there's a shadow to each of these potential upsides, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right now because there's enough good stuff to talk about, I think. Okay, and the last thing to say is that maybe normally my talks are more of a tutorial and scientific nature, and so they're lush with high resolution imagery. This is not so much. This, unfortunately, is mostly a talking head because it's from textual notes, and it's a little more abstract, okay, and fast moving. So the ideas are going to be roughly classified into 4 categories, and sequentially we're going to go through them. One is potential upsides in the sort of technical, scientific, and medical fields. And that might be more of the bulk of the talk because that's sort of where I live, is in technical and even to some extent molecular biology areas in the past. Then that'll segue into possible economic upsides of the COVID-19 pandemic. And these things overlap, and then that's going to segue into potential cultural upsides. And then that can segue into potential spiritual upsides, for lack of a better word. And, obviously these things are going to get a little bit maybe more far out and subjective as we move through the technical to economic to cultural to spiritual spectrum. But nevertheless, that's how I've chosen to organize it. You got to organize this stuff some way. So just to say, so I'm an aerospace engineer and applied physicist. I work at Planet Labs, a satellite imaging company. I spent 32 plus years at NASA working on a whole variety of different things. But one of the interesting things is that a bunch of the work I did at NASA was on what's called quantum chemistry or molecular physics, or I was basically studying molecules, and then that got me really into molecular biology, which I didn't really do at for NASA, but I got really into it and started collaborating with a bunch of immunologist and virologist friends over many years now, and that's kind of ebbed and flowed and waxed and waned. But I did teach myself a fair bit of molecular biology, and particularly I was involved at first in it back in the late 80s, early 90s. So that's going to inform some of this perspective on what's going on now in an exact way. Yeah, and then curiously enough, my whole introduction to molecular biology back in the late 80s and early 90s happened to be because I was friends with a couple who were immunologists in Philly. And so I got interested in immunology as the first thing. And then that immediately I would say, well, I have to learn some biology. So I like went to the library or to the bookstore, I think it was a used bookstore. And I kind of did, the bibliomantic trance. Remember when we had used bookstores and you could go just walk around in them and figure out what caught your fancy? Well, that's what I did. And I reached out and I grabbed this book off the shelf called The Design of Life, which is by a famous virologist named Renato Del Becco. It's still a wonderful book. And it's a introduction to molecular biology, all of biology really, through the lens of viruses. And so he kind of uses that as his perspective to explain most of modern biology as it was in the late 80s and early 90s. Obviously, a lot has happened, but a lot had already happened by that time. So anyway, here's the thing. And this is all this a background to my very first potential upside of COVID-19. Last bit of background. All this stuff was happening in immunology and virology, and one of the reasons was HIV/AIDS. Okay, so you have to remember, if you're old enough, or you have to just learn, or maybe you already know if you're too young, that AIDS was actually a much bigger deal in many ways than COVID-19. And that was because when it first burst onto the scene, it was viewed as an existential threat to human life, which COVID-19 is. No one would argue that it's an existential threat to all human life. AIDS was a disease that was 100% fatal to everyone who got it. It was transmitted through sex and from mother to child, which means it could be like if the species was going to procreate, and if AIDS was spreading, it would just possibly spread to everybody and extinguish the species. And it wasn't even known what really initially much about it, but what was known was that it was 100% fatal. There was no vaccine, there was no treatment, there was no cure, there was no exceptions, and it was spread, as I said, through sex and through childbirth. And so that looked like a serious threat. So for that and for other reasons, right, it was a challenging disease. It was a disease which seemed to be cutting down large numbers of people in the prime of their life, unlike, say, just hurting the old and the sick, which is a situation more like what we're in now. There was a lot of effort that started to turn onto AIDS, HIV. In fact, a great deal of the molecular biology and health science and public health and a lot of the whole disease studying, disease treating infrastructure of the world, like practically every lab was working on HIV/AIDS after a little while. And what happened? Well, there's good things and bad things that happened. The good things that happened are that our knowledge of immunology and virology and viral disease progress and vaccines and all this stuff just exploded because of all this work studying HIV/AIDS. And so a huge amount of the progress, which we're now leveraging, frankly, for COVID-19 and vaccines and the studying and the sequencing and all this kind of stuff, a lot of that actually happened or is available to us because of the giant worldwide work that went into AIDS and HIV. And that's the good side of what happened with AIDS, HIV. Kind of the bad side is, 35 years later, and thousands of labs working on this problem, there is still no vaccine for AIDS, HIV. So bear that in mind, everyone who thinks we're going to just stay locked down and cowering in our houses till there's a vaccine for COVID. AIDS, HIV is a very different disease. It's a harder disease, presumably, and a more subtle disease, but nevertheless, you have to wonder about this vaccine timetable stuff when SARS-CoV-1, probably the most COVID-like virus that we know about, that came along in 2002. People worked really hard. There's still no vaccine that's really spread. I mean, there's no vaccine that's been approved for humans as far as I know. Various reasons for that, but people did work long and hard. So everyone who says, we're going to have a vaccine in 18 months when the fastest vaccine we ever developed for a novel virus was a mumps vaccine that took 4 years, we should probably have a plan B, in my opinion, to, everybody wait and do nothing until there's a vaccine. So, but I'm supposed to concentrate on upside. So here is the upside that all this leads me to believe. And that is, I don't know if and when there'll be a vaccine for COVID-19, but what I do know is everybody in molecular biology, virology, immunology, public health, et cetera, biotech, all the startups, everybody has pivoted pretty much to COVID-19. So what we have is this gigantic, massive amount of money and resources and brain power and effort and communications going into solving this problem. Now, does it mean we will solve this problem because of some molecular biology techniques? Maybe not, or maybe not soon enough, whatever that means. But what it will mean is that there will be a new explosion and a new renaissance in understanding of virology and immunology and public health. And so that is going to serve us well into the future with other pandemics and other diseases. We're going to pray, we're going to possibly be thanking nature for releasing this virus onto us, a virus that, was not anywhere near as horrible as it could have been, but which basically focused the world once again on viral diseases and immunology and vaccines and treatments and antivirals and got us ready for the big one. And also just, may even give us a cure for the common cold and all kinds of things we've been kind of pining for centuries. This might happen because of SARS-CoV-2. So this first upside is kind of like there's going to be this explosion in understanding of viruses and immunology and related matters. And that's going to stand us in good stead, whatever the actual timetable for a COVID-19 vaccine might be. So that's kind of the first upside, and that's the longest one. So the next upside I want to talk about in the scientific, technical, medical realm is what I like to call, other people call the elephant in the room, and that is metabolic disease, okay? And I know this is a slightly controversial topic, and I've gotten a fair bit of hate for it on social media, but I just can't stop punishing myself by posting about this. So this is basically metabolic health, immunological health, and its relationship to the progression of influenza-like diseases, and in particular COVID-19. So it seems like the evidence just keeps coming, and it's pretty much overwhelmingly clear, I believe, and of course I have my biases, but it's overwhelmingly clear to me and to a lot of people who are studying this that your underlying metabolic immunological health has a titanic effect on the likelihood of serious disease progress if you get infected with COVID. So basically what it looks like is 90+%, maybe 92, 93, 94% of the people who end up hospitalized with COVID have underlying illnesses, which are basically metabolic illnesses like diabetes, hypertension, and obesity, to some extent other diseases, but those are the big ones, okay? A metabolic syndrome, there's a lot of things that are all clustered together. So if you're in the hospital with COVID, it looks like it's like 93 or 94% certain that you've got one of these metabolic diseases, okay? And if you die in the hospital of COVID, it is something like 97, 98% likely that you have one of these underlying metabolic diseases. And I conjecture, although I haven't done the data analysis on this because I haven't found the data in a transparent form yet, and I'd love any help from anybody who has access to actual records, tables of data, CSV files of individual cases. What I suspect is that if we correctly, I suspect two things I'm going to say about the data. One is that if we could include in the underlying illnesses category, which are officially noted as just certain major ones like diabetes, hypertension, body mass index above 35, and I think cancer and cardiopulmonary disease, or COPD, forgot what that stands for. Anyway, if you add to those 5 or 6 underlying illnesses in different jurisdictions classified differently, if you add pre-diabetes and high insulin and high blood glucose variability and metabolic syndrome and high IL-6 and high inflammatory markers and all the other things which are also tend to be correlated, you're going to probably, I would suspect, catch almost everyone. And what I mean is that almost 100% of the people hospitalized and dying from COVID are going to have, you're going to find out they have these underlying conditions. So why is that good? Okay, well, that is good is because it is, I think, among many things, A, it's important to understand the disease, but B, it is a wake-up call, all right? Because the way I see it, I've been obsessed with this for a long time. We have had like this 30-year or 50-year slow motion unfolding train wreck of metabolic disease in the developed world, led, quote unquote, by the United States, where, we have like 40% of the people have diabetes, or 27% have diabetes, and 40% are predicted to have diabetes, and 70% appear to have pre-diabetes. And, projected over the next 30 years, we're going to have like massive numbers of people sick and dying and unable to work and be productive because of metabolic disease. This is what was kind of going to happen. I think most people who study this saw that. It's going to bankrupt the healthcare systems, whatever kind you have, whether you have socialized medicine or single payer or private, it doesn't really matter. It's going to bankrupt the healthcare systems in the developed world, and hence bankrupt the governments in the developed world, trying to have a population whose significant majority of whom are disabled because of metabolic disease, and quite more frequently in the prime of their life, like in their 40s and 50s, when they should be super productive. Anyway, why is that a good thing? It's a good thing because COVID has, to some extent, compressed and accelerated this process. It's making these people, well, I wouldn't say it's making them sick, because still most of them don't get sick and die from COVID. But those who get sick and die from COVID tend to be from this cohort of metabolically ill people. And it is a wake-up call. It's like, here's how I look at it. If your doctor says to you, you've got to lose that belly fat and stop eating that junk food, because if you don't, you have a 30% increased risk of getting a heart attack over the next 10 years, most people aren't going to take action on that. They're just a 30% risk of something, one particular thing happening over 10 years is not really going to spur them to action. But if instead, because this data comes out and is talked about, that if you have metabolic illness, if you have too much belly fat, or you have too high blood pressure, that you have a 30-fold increased risk of dying alone on a ventilator next year when the virus comes around again, that's actionable. Like most people can actually reverse and even cure their metabolic disease in a matter of a few months. And so that means by next year, when we are told quite with some likelihood, this virus will come back during flu season, which is another whole story about sunlight and vitamin D. But that will wake people up. I think that is actionable. It's like, I can do something in a couple of months that will literally decrease my risk by orders of magnitude for if I ever get infected with another coronavirus, another deadly coronavirus. Okay. And by the way, probably it'll prevent me from getting influenza and colds and all these other things to a large extent as well. And oh, by the way, even if none of these viruses ever come back, it'll extend my health span possibly for decades. So this is an upside that we might be able, in fact, the way I like to say it is the COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus might end up saving more lives than it takes if we leverage this point about metabolic health being primary for survival of these diseases. So, especially if there's, in a way, it almost makes me hope there's no vaccine, because a vaccine will allow people to be lazy. They'll get the vaccine, and then they'll be like, well, I can just keep, eating potato chips and watching TV, and I'll be fine. So in a way, I'm kind of okay with there not being a vaccine if we can leverage the knowledge that metabolic health is so strongly correlated with survival, and actually correlated with asymptomatic progression. Okay, so maybe that's enough for science and technology. Let's see, how are we on time? Remind me how long we have, Sebastian, because I want some time for discussion.
We have, good question. I need to just
till 1:30.
Yeah,
till...
I think so. Yeah, so you start at 45, so you'll have till 30. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'll be able to breeze through some more of this stuff more quickly, and then we'll have time for discussion. Okay, so yeah, I mean, normally I would be presenting like all these data tables and stuff, but it's not it's not important right now. So here's okay. So here is a related. We're going to move now into maybe economic potential economic upsides of COVID-19. We'll come back to the one I was about to say. Well, let's start with this. So we have been sort of engaged globally in this race to the bottom with production and supply chains and optimizing for short-term profit, right? We all know this now. We probably got over-reliant on, Chinese suppliers of certain critical goods. Why was this? Because big companies could save a couple of percent by offshoring. They could make a few percent more profit by offshoring, and it was in short term, purely economic efficiency, not considering externalized costs, such as possibility of disruption because of pandemic or other political problems. I mean, it made sense to do this offshoring if you are a CEO who has a legal fiducial responsibility to your stockholders. However, in retrospect, maybe this wasn't the best idea collectively or even for long-term profits. So I think that one of the upsides of the virus is going to be, we're going to realize we probably want to optimize for some additional criteria in our capitalist systems and our businesses, for some resiliency, some redundancy, some defense in depth, some decentralization, and as well as so make sure all our supplies aren't like going through one critical place that, oh, by the way, in this case happens to be the place where all these deadly viruses have come out for decades and decades, or not all of them, but many of them. That exact region of China is where a lot of these bad diseases have crossed over, and it happens, strangely enough, to be the place that we concentrated all this manufacturing. So that's interesting, and it's probably something we want to learn from the whole world and change. Not that China's bad, none of this. China, very hardworking, very productive, made a lot of people a lot of money, brought a lot of people out of poverty into a middle class. But there is always it's a two-edged sword. So we need to have some more some onshoring, some domestic production, some inventory, like all this just-in-time stuff, in a way maybe has turned out to be stupid, especially if you have certain goods that are that won't spoil, that are like non-volatile, I guess if you call them, or non-perishable goods. Like maybe it makes sense to have them warehoused in places and not just have a just-in-time system where you never have any stores, because that represents, unused capital or something like that. It might be that we realize that just in time we became over reliant on it, and it has a hidden cost. Yeah, this all goes into this kind of externalities, and maybe we've learned a few. Again, it's like climate change. It's hard for anybody to get serious about climate costs as an externality, because who knows how many decades it's going to take to, hurt me. But viruses and pandemics, that's another matter. That's a little bit more in your face. And so perhaps this is an externality that we will start to pay some attention to and factor in, because it really can affect the bottom line, apparently, of these companies over, relatively short time horizons, especially when it's a disease as virulent as this one. So yeah, a lot of industries, medicine, durable goods, airlines, I mean, they're going to have plans for these types of things and how to be more resilient. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, well, what are you saying? We just put the economy on pause every time something starts to infect people. And that's crazy. You can't just stop the economy every year for a month. Well, interestingly enough, the French do, pretty much. So it is possible to make an economy that really ratchets down once a year for a month if necessary. So that's a lesson to us. Maybe we can, it's sort of tongue in cheek, but let's look at how the French do it, because
Indeed, we do.
all go. Yeah. Okay. So then there's another this is another economic ramification or potential upside. Okay. And it relates back to this metabolic disease thing I was flaming about a little while ago. And that is that, why do so many people have metabolic disease in the US and in Western Europe and now in India and China and everywhere, whose standards of living are rising? To a large extent, it's a complicated thing, and let's ignore pollution for the moment. To a large extent, it's because of diet. It's because of the worldwide disaster of the health authorities, including the WHO and the CDC and all these people we look to for guidance. They have been promoting a low-fat, high-carb diet based on flawed studies from about 50 years ago, and they've promoted this diet relentlessly, telling people to cut out fats and cut out animal products and eat sugar and eat grains. And we've had just an explosion in all sorts of degenerative diseases worldwide over that time. Cancer, heart disease is complicated because there was a decrease in smoking, which without the decrease in smoking, heart disease would have also been exploding over the last 50 years. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, all kinds of autoimmune diseases, all these things have been skyrocketing over the last 50 years. And a lot of people who study this pretty hard, I think, have come to the conclusion that this is to some large extent due to the, the sugar and grain and processed food, seed oils, and all this kind of, there's this sort of a handful of toxic ingredients that people have been really encouraged to eat by the food pyramid and all those world and US agencies that are pushing the food pyramid, when arguably the food pyramid is upside down. And we could go into that in more detail at some other time. But here's the thing, crappy processed food, which is what you get when you do a race to the bottom with a centralized system, and you have a bunch of government subsidies that are not necessarily, well, they might have some perverse incentives in some of these subsidies. So you subsidize monocrop soy and monocrop corn, and you get all this soy oil and you get all this corn syrup, and it's ultra cheap. But even so, the farmers are going out of business and the soils are being depleted because everything is subsidized to make this industrial high external input monocrop agriculture, which looks profitable perhaps in the short term if you're a big ag company, not so profitable if you're a farmer. But anyway, it's flooding the market with cheap, horrible food, and people are getting metabolic disease. And look what happens. They're extremely susceptible to COVID. Well, okay, maybe we'll wake up then. Maybe this is part of a wake-up call where we start to realize, there are some costs to large amounts of cheap food for everybody. As Michael Pollan said in his Omnivore's Dilemma book, for the first time in history, we have a large segment of the population that is overfed and undernourished simultaneously. And so if people realize this, it might not just help them correct their diets, but as part of correcting their diets and eating smaller amounts of wholesome food instead of larger amounts of terrible toxic food, it would correct the agriculture system. We have these meat packing plants shutting down because of COVID, and maybe this is, again, an argument that says we shouldn't have our supply chain concentrated in a few areas that are overcrowded and prone to disease. We should have our food supply chains distributed with, happy cows on grasslands instead of unhappy cows crammed into CAFOs and things like that. So again, there is a possibility that we can leverage this crisis because it's kind of it's happening in a time frame that people's attention spans aren't going to get too distracted. We could leverage this crisis to make some absolutely necessary and beneficial changes to our food system, changes that would be beneficial to everybody, or almost everybody, including even some of the big ag companies if they just acted on it. I mean, it might not be so beneficial for the fertilizer and pesticide companies, but even the meat packing companies could distribute, diversify, and go towards more healthy. I mean, a lot of these companies will frankly do what the people ask for. Like if the people ask for low fat, which they did based on mistaken data, these companies will pivot to make low fat. If the people are asking now for high fat, healthy, locally sourced foods, then presumably these companies can figure out how to meet that demand if that's what it's going to mean for them to be profitable. So I hope that people wake up. I hope that the government starts to become a little transparent and admit some of their failings in their diet and agriculture policies, and that we can turn a lot of things around, including the health of our soils and all these long-term things, because of the virus. It's almost like it was a gift in this sense. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, institutionalized pausing we talked to. So let's get into now some more spiritual stuff, or cultural stuff. There's this idea that that some strange things are happening, like Donald Trump, who's not generally considered, a friend of the little guy, in spite of what he campaigns on, is, here he's got practically becoming a socialist, trying to give away all this money to people. We're obviously going to have some rethinking of some of our centralized or some of our, I think we're going to have some, this has shaken people up, and hopefully it hasn't just shaken them up to be more polarized in their filter bubbles. Maybe it's shaken them up to listen to some alternative opinions right now. I mean, the idea that you would have a Republican kind of basically moving towards a UBI, that's kind of strange to me, and it's okay, I mean, I'm not trying to be a Trump supporter here, but I am trying to say that I think there's a harbinger of some change happening. So that would, another cultural social upside of this is our friends in the existential risk community might be taken more seriously now. Certainly people are going to take more seriously the idea of really horrible pandemics. I mean, as we well know, we got off easy on this one, comparatively, right? It could have been Ebola that was transmitted through the air, and it was not. All right. And yeah, so the existential risk community might get taken more seriously, and also they might actually start to pivot towards looking at problems that are a little bit more pragmatic, shall we say, rather than worrying about artificial general intelligence and the fact that we might be living in a simulation. Maybe they could worry about things like diseases and economic collapse. Yeah, maybe people will also start to get serious about science. I mean, we talk about this a lot. Anders Sandberg pointed out to me the other day that this exact thing that's happening right now has been in the microbiology textbooks for decades. Like, as we know, it's not just that there was some government report that Trump ignored a few months ago. This stuff has been in the biology textbooks for decades. This exact thing was going to happen. The virus was going to come out of China, jump over from bats, and cause a worldwide situation. So maybe people will start to take more seriously common knowledge, if you will, even if it's not so common to them, common scientific knowledge. Take tail risks a little more seriously, even though Nassim Taleb says this was not a black swan. In some sense, I think it might be a black swan. Another cultural advantage to this might be that we realize that we can actually survive hard times. And actually get some serious perspective on how hard this was compared to other diseases like 1918 or smallpox or something like that. Like, let's put things in perspective here. This is not the bubonic plague, and humanity has survived worse. So maybe we'll get some perspective. I know it's hard to do though, especially if you're less fortunate than some of us are. Yeah, perspective comes after breakfast, I guess. And then of course the last sort of cultural one, before I jump into the spiritual at the very end, the last cultural potential upside I might talk about, again, this has been fairly common, but let's add it for completion, is that this is perhaps the first time in our lifetime, and maybe the first time ever, where humanity has been globally united in a non-ideological, non-sectarian, non-political way against a common enemy or a common problem. And it's not a zero-sum thing. If we play it right, it's not like there have to be winners and losers in this game. If there's a successful vaccine or successful treatment or successful changes that we make in response to what we learn, all these things can benefit the whole planet. And I think we're seeing that with at least in the science community, with the flow of information on preprints and things like that. So this is very interesting to have all or so much of human ingenuity, whatever country they're in, whatever race they are, concentrated on solving this problem. That may not be the last time that happens, but it may be the first time that it's happened. Okay, so I'm going to just end with some spiritual ideas about this. So, well, we're running out of time here, so let's just end it with this. Two things. One is this I got from the New York Times, we may come out of this, at least in the US, with an appreciation for frontline workers, laborers, especially us who are in sort of the intellectual knowledge worker class who get to sit home and have stuff delivered every day and complain about how the lockdown is not safe enough and we're not ready to, open up. Meanwhile, we've got all these people out there, working in hospitals, working in sewage treatment plants, working in electrical generation stations, driving trucks, delivering stuff, all these people who are actually out there taking risks. We need to honor them and value them and thank them for their service. In the same way that people would be saying that to all these military people, the idea is that we could possibly have a sort of demilitarization of American patriotism and thank people for their service to the country who are not soldiers, or not only soldiers, but who are all these other people who, by the way, tend to wear uniforms, right? Delivery workers and doctors and all these people wear uniforms, and we need to honor them, thank them for their service, and think about that, and be extremely grateful for the situation that we find ourselves in. And yeah, so I think in general, I'll end with the last spiritual upside that I want to talk about, and that is just we have to learn to be grateful. We have to learn to be grateful for this virus. And I don't mean to be facetious, like grateful because you died, or someone close to you died, or you got laid off. That is, of course, not what I mean. What I mean is in the long term, there are things we can learn from this, and we can make the world a better place in many different ways because of this. And so for that, I think we need to be grateful and maybe even think that nature, I'm not a religious person per se, but that there is the wisdom to nature sometimes. And that I could imagine if I were Mother Nature and I were a conscious being, I'd be like, these humans, they need a warning. I'm not ready to kill them, but I'm definitely going to slap them like I would a misbehaving child, because they have to learn that there are consequences to some of the things they do. So I'm going to end it with that. And thank you.
Thank you, Creon. I was listening to your talk, and when you were talking about the metabolic diseases, et cetera, in my mind, I was thinking, yeah, well, all these trends toward more local economies, local food production, et cetera. Well, naturally, that would tend towards reduction of metabolic diseases because people will be eating better food, presumably, more locally sourced food, less sugar, more processed food, et cetera. So I think that makes a lot of sense from a high level theoretical perspective. I'm somewhat more pessimistic that might end up being the case. I feel like, we're going to settle in again at some happy middle, maybe, of course, perhaps local foods and locally sourced food will be more prevalent, but I don't think that entirely takes away all the processed food and the decades and decades of like you mentioned, right, the bad food policy that we've had that's really hard to unwind even in a crisis like this.
Right. I agree. A lot of these things may be naive and over optimistic, and so be it. They still should be probably mentioned. But the other thing is that it almost makes me hope that there's a partial food system collapse. It almost makes me hope.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
That the shelves are empty for a while, and Tyson and these other big kind of maximally profit oriented, minimally health oriented food processors get fucked, and that the people go hungry. Why? I don't want anybody starving, but quite frankly, almost everybody could go for a week or two without food, and they would actually be fine once they got over the first 24 hours. I mean, this is totally well known, especially overweight people. In fact, arguably, there's nothing better for them than to go on an extended fast, provided they don't, provided they drink enough water, and, I don't want to oversimplify here, but in general, sensible fasting is one of the most healthiest things you can do, particularly if you have visceral fat or if you're overweight. And you have fatty liver. There's all this bullshit about fatty liver and thousands of papers and all this kind of stuff. You know what you can do to get rid of fatty liver? Fast for 3 days, and you will be done with fatty liver, at least until you start overeating again, or overeating sugar again. Anyway, but what I was going to say is, if there is some serious food system disruption and people have to go hungry for a little while, they will start to really wonder, did we do it right? Is there another way? How should I protect myself next time something like this happens? So I'm a little bit worried that things don't get disrupted enough to encourage people to take some serious look at solutions that may be less profitable in the short term, but more beneficial in the long term, like more decentralization in our food system.
Well, we're gonna have to end there. This is a topic that I'm personally very, very interested and passionate about. So I'd love to continue this discussion in perhaps another venue. But thanks for joining us today and sharing all the upsides. For the last 2 days, we've been talking about the potential disaster that is upon us. Financial disaster, sanitary disaster, privacy disaster, and everything else that comes with it. And so it's good to get a little bit of sort of positivity and some of the potential upsides of this crisis. Certainly,
well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk. I tried to answer someone's question, but I think I blew it. There's her person who wanted to talk about mRNA viruses, and I guess he can contact me offline. I'd love to talk about that. I have some contrary opinions on that. But hey, yeah, if anyone wants to send me additional ideas for upsides of COVID-19, I'm Creon on Twitter, at Creon, Creon. Okay.
Thanks, Creon. You're welcome to stay on if you want to continue watching the rest of the talks. There's only
sure
2 talks.
Okay.
Left, so yeah.
Okay. Cool.
All right. Cheers.